The old janitor sits alone in the hospital cafeteria during his lunch break, a thick medical journal open before him, his calloused fingers turning pages filled with complex diagrams and dense text. Around him, nurses and orderlies snicker, whispering comments he pretends not to hear. They see only the mop, the bucket, the uniform faded from 1,000 washings. They don't see the man beneath, the one who gave up everything for a secret that could destroy him. But when a crisis hits the operating room and the best surgeons in the hospital stand paralyzed, unable to save a dying child, it's this janitor who steps forward with knowledge they never suspected he possessed. What they discover in the next 72 hours will shatter every assumption they made about him and force the hospital to confront a question no one wants to answer. What happens when the person you've dismissed is actually the only one capable of saving your life? Marcus Webb had been scrubbing the floors of St. Michael's Hospital for 14 years. And in that time, he'd learned something that most people never understand. The floor is the best place to watch a building's secrets. When you're down on your knees, your eyes level with the world's underbelly, people forget you're there. Doctors hurried past discussing cases they thought were private. Nurses chatted about hospital politics while he worked around their feet. Security guards complained about administrators who'd embarrassed them. The hospital revealed itself to Marcus in fragments and whispered conversations, like a patient confessing sins to a priest, and he listened to every word. The cafeteria was his refuge, the one place during his shift where he could sit without the weight of others' contempt pressing down on him. It was a Tuesday in October when things began to unravel, a cold autumn morning that smelled like rain and cleaning solution, a smell that had become so familiar it felt like part of his skin. Marcus sat in his usual corner, away from the main cluster of tables, the journal spread out before him. It was a recent edition of The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical publications in the world, and he was reading about a new surgical technique for thoracic interventions that had begun to emerge from clinics in South Korea. "Hey, Jenkins." The voice came from behind him. It belonged to Dr. Richard Caldwell, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he'd never once felt uncertain in his life. He wasn't addressing Marcus by his real name. He'd done that once, years ago, and it hadn't stuck. To most of the hospital staff, Marcus was simply the janitor, and the few who bothered to learn his name found it easier to call him by his family name or simply forget it altogether. Marcus looked up, closing the journal slowly. He'd learned long ago not to move too quickly when addressed by someone of importance. Sudden movements made people uncomfortable. "Yes, sir?" "Reading medical journals?" Caldwell's tone carried the kind of amusement usually reserved for watching a dog attempt algebra. Around him, two younger doctors, residents by the look of their badges, smiled. One of them was Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant surgeon in her early 30s who had joined the cardiothoracic unit 6 months earlier. She was watching the interaction with something like pity in her eyes, and Marcus found that worse than contempt. "Just keeping informed," Marcus said quietly, marking his place and closing the journal. "Never know when you might learn something useful." "I'm sure that's true," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with the kind of patronizing sweetness that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "Very admirable. Self-improvement and all that." He turned to the residents. "Come on, gentlemen. Let's leave Mr. Jenkins to his reading. I'm sure he'll be back to the floors in a few minutes." They walked away laughing, and Marcus forced himself to count slowly to 10 before reopening the journal. Sarah Chen remained for a moment longer. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fraction of a second, Marcus saw something he didn't expect. A glimmer of recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. She looked away first and followed Caldwell, leaving Marcus alone with his journal and the weight of questions he couldn't answer. The truth about Marcus Webb was a scar he carried in silence, one he'd spent 14 years trying to outrun, and 14 years failing at that simple task. He had been a surgeon once. Not just any surgeon, but a promising one. The kind whose name appeared in publications and whose research had been cited by leading institutions worldwide. His name had been Marcus Webb, and he'd worked at Georgetown Medical Center in Washington, D.C., performing complex cardiac surgeries with a success rate that was statistically remarkable. He'd been on track to become one of the most respected surgeons in the country, perhaps even the world. Then came the night that changed everything. A patient named James Hartley, a 43-year-old judge with a history of heart disease, had been brought in for what should have been a routine procedure, a ventricular assist device implantation. Marcus had performed the surgery hundreds of times before. He knew every layer of tissue, every crucial vessel, every delicate movement required to navigate the human heart without causing catastrophic damage. But that night, he'd been distracted. His marriage was falling apart. His wife had told him that morning that she was leaving him, that she couldn't live with the obsession, the constant absence, the way his work consumed him completely. He'd gone into the operating room anyway because cancelling surgeries wasn't something surgeons did lightly. Patients had already made their peace with the possibility of death. Families were braced for the worst. The machinery was ready, the team was assembled. And Marcus was the best there was. Everyone knew that. A distracted Marcus was probably still better than most surgeons at their peak. It was a calculation that cost James Hartley his life. The error, when it came, had been impossibly small. A fraction of a millimeter, a moment's lapse in concentration that caused him to nick the left anterior descending artery as he positioned the device. It was the kind of mistake that could happen to anyone, that had probably happened to countless surgeons throughout medical history. But it had happened to Marcus, and James Hartley's family had decided that that mattered. They'd sued. The hospital had settled, which meant the hospital had acknowledged responsibility. The medical board had investigated, and while they'd found no clear evidence of gross negligence, they'd found something they considered nearly as damaging: a pattern of concerning behavior, a surgeon working while emotionally compromised, notes in his file indicating that colleagues had voiced concerns about his mental state. The board had not revoked his license. They'd been more insidious than that. They'd suspended it for 2 years, pending completion of a psychological evaluation and re-evaluation of his competency. It was meant to be protective, a way to ensure that Marcus was fit to practice. But in reality, it had been an ending disguised as a pause. Hospitals didn't want to hire a surgeon with a suspension on his record. Malpractice insurance companies didn't want to cover him. And Marcus, broken and exhausted and carrying the weight of a man's death in his chest like a second heart, had stopped fighting to reclaim what he'd lost. He'd moved to Philadelphia, changed his name on his everyday identification, and taken a job as a janitor at St. Michael's Hospital. It wasn't a conscious decision to stay in medicine. It was more like gravity. He couldn't leave. Being in a hospital, even in the lowest capacity, meant he was still part of the world he'd loved. It meant he could still read the journals, still attend lectures when he could sneak into the back of conference rooms, still understand the language of medicine, even if he could no longer speak it. The years had accumulated. He'd gotten older. The possibility of returning to surgery had become, year by year, less realistic. The suspension had long since ended, but by then, Marcus had become someone else. Someone so accustomed to invisibility that the thought of reclaiming his identity felt like impersonation. The weeks after the cafeteria incident were unremarkable on the surface. Marcus continued his work, continued his reading, continued his careful invisibility. But something had shifted. He noticed that Sarah Chen had begun to look at him differently. She would sometimes linger when he was cleaning near her office, reading silently over his shoulder. One day, he found a copy of a recent paper on advanced arterial graft techniques left on the counter where he was mopping, placed too carefully to be accidental. Another day, a highlighter and a stack of surgical abstracts appeared in the break room, positioned where only he would find them. It was a slow realization, like watching a photograph develop in chemical solution, and it terrified him. Sarah Chen was testing him, he understood. She was checking something, and she was smart enough to do it quietly. The crisis came on a Friday evening in late November, the kind of evening where the city outside was already sliding into winter darkness, while the hospital blazed with fluorescent light and purpose. An emergency admission came through the trauma bay, a 7-year-old girl named Eliana Torres, brought in by her mother after a devastating car accident. The dashboard had struck the child's chest, and the initial imaging showed something that made the trauma surgeons pale: a profound lacerations to the myocardium, the heart muscle itself. It was the kind of injury that children didn't survive. The heart was too delicate, too crucial, too protected by the ribcage for any intrusion to be anything other than catastrophic. The emergency surgeons had moved her to intensive care and called for Caldwell. If anyone could do something, If anyone could find a way to salvage this, it would be the chief of cardiothoracic surgery. Marcus was mopping the hallway outside the ICU when Caldwell hurried past, his face grim. The surgery would take hours, Caldwell had told the nurses. They would need to place the child on extracorporeal membrane oxygenation support immediately. The ECMO machine, which would take over the function of her heart and lungs while they worked. It was a miracle of modern medicine, a way to buy time when there was no time to buy. The mortality rate for pediatric thoracic trauma was nearly 100%. Even with ECMO, even with the best surgeon in the hospital, the odds were unforgiving. Marcus had continued mopping, his movements methodical, his mind working through the problem. A myocardial laceration in a child. The tissue would be fragile, the heart still developing, the margins of the injury unpredictable. Standard suturing techniques wouldn't work. The tissue would tear. You'd need something that could provide both flexibility and strength. Something that could accommodate the growth and movement of the heart over time. Something like the newer graft techniques he'd been reading about, the ones he'd been studying in obscure Korean and European surgical journals, the ones he'd been absorbing in the quiet hours of his breaks. It took 5 hours for Caldwell to admit defeat. Marcus heard it from the nurses who passed him in the hallway, their voices tight with desperation and sorrow. They'd tried everything. The laceration was too extensive. When they attempted to repair it with standard techniques, the tissue continued to shred. Cooling the heart, attempting to create scar tissue that might seal, introducing grafts, nothing held. Eliana Torres was going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The child's mother was in the family waiting room, crying in a language Marcus recognized as Spanish. He'd grown up in a neighborhood in Philadelphia where Spanish was the common tongue, where his own mother had spoken it to him before she'd insisted he learn English, before she'd pushed him toward the life of a middle-class professional. The mother was holding a rosary, and Marcus found himself pausing with his mop and bucket, offering a silent prayer to a God he didn't entirely believe in for a child he didn't know. It was Sarah Chen who found him in the hallway 10 minutes later. "Come with me," she said quietly, not as a question but as a command. Marcus straightened, the mop handle loose in his hand. He was conscious suddenly of how he must look. The uniform, the bucket, the exhaustion that 14 years of this work had carved into his face. "Where?" he asked carefully. "Surgical suite. Now. Please don't ask questions, and please don't tell anyone I brought you there." She walked away without waiting for his response, and Marcus found himself following, his legs moving with a certainty that his mind was still trying to catch up with. The surgical suite was a place where he wasn't supposed to be, not in any official capacity. Janitors cleaned up after surgeries, not during them. But Sarah didn't stop to explain or justify. She led him through the corridors and into the observation gallery above the operating room, where Caldwell was still working, still desperately attempting something, anything, to save the little girl's life. Below, in the bright light of the operating room, Eliana Torres lay on the surgical table, her chest open, the machinery of modern medicine surrounding her in a constellation of beeping monitors and flowing lines. The ECMO machine hummed softly, doing the work her failing heart couldn't do. And there, bent over the child's myocardium, his hands moving with the kind of precision that came from long practice and longer heartbreak, was Dr. Richard Caldwell. He was losing, and he knew it. "There," Sarah said quietly, pointing to the injury site. "You've been reading about solutions for that. What would you do?" Marcus stared. His mouth had gone dry. He was acutely aware that there was no possible response that wouldn't reveal everything, that wouldn't destroy the careful camouflage he'd built. But there was also a child dying, and the only thing Marcus had ever been truly good at was saving lives. "The standard graft won't hold on the tissue," he said quietly, hearing his voice shift into the tones of a surgeon, losing the careful inflection of servility he'd maintained for 14 years. "Too much movement, too much fragility. But there's a technique, not standard, not widely adopted here in the States, but there's research coming out of Seoul from Dr. Minjun Park's lab. They've been experimenting with autologous pericardial grafts, using the patient's own tissue from the pericardium, but reinforcing it with a biocompatible mesh that's being developed at the University of Copenhagen. The mesh is still in trial stages, but it's designed to strengthen tissue while still allowing for normal cardiac function and growth. Do you know the specifics? Sarah's voice was urgent now. Yes, Marcus said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 14 years. I know them. What happened next happened very quickly. Sarah left the observation gallery and returned 5 minutes later with the hospital's chief of surgery, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a woman in her 70s who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Sarah explained quickly and without elaboration that she had found someone with specific knowledge that could help with the Torres case. She didn't explain who Marcus was or why he was there. Dr. Okonkwo simply looked at him, her dark eyes sharp and assessing, and asked him a series of technical questions. He answered everyone perfectly. Do we have the materials here? Okonkwo asked Sarah. The mesh is experimental, but we have 2 units in the research wing, donated by the manufacturer for trial purposes. They were being used for a different application, but the specification should be compatible. Okonkwo made a decision in the space of 3 seconds. Get them. And you, she said, pointing to Marcus, come with me. We're going to need you in the operating room. I'm not credentialed, Marcus said quietly. I can't. You can observe and advise, Okonkwo said. And you're going to, because a 7-year-old girl is dying and you clearly know something that might save her. The hospital will handle the liability and we'll deal with the explanations afterward. Right now, I want to know if what you're suggesting is viable. In the changing room, a young nurse looked at Marcus with confusion as he was given surgical scrubs and a protective gown. She clearly had no idea who he was, and that anonymity felt precious suddenly, like the last gift he would ever receive. Caldwell's face when Marcus entered the operating room was something Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. It was shock first, then recognition, not of Marcus's identity, but of his presence, the impossible intrusion of the hospital's janitor into the sanctified space of the operating room. But before Caldwell could speak, before he could eject Marcus from the room, Okonkwo was there. Dr. Webb has specific expertise relevant to this case, she said firmly, using his name for the first time, and the sound of it in this place, in this context, felt like a resurrection. He's going to consult on the next procedure. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Whatever conflict was happening in his mind, he buried it under the weight of professional necessity. The child was dying. This was not the moment for pride or protocol. Walk me through what you're thinking, Caldwell said. And the fact that he asked the question, that he accepted Marcus's presence even for the space of a conversation, felt like a kind of forgiveness neither of them had expected to give or receive. Marcus explained the technique step by step, the preparation of the pericardial graft, the thin tissue that surrounded the heart, which the body had already accepted and which wouldn't trigger an immune response. The placement of the biocompatible mesh beneath it, reinforcing the tissue without restricting its movement. The specific suturing technique that would allow for both strength and flexibility, that would accommodate growth as Eliana Torres's heart developed over the years. When the mesh arrived from the research wing, Marcus helped Caldwell prepare it. Working side by side, they became something neither had been before, not teacher and student, not surgeon and janitor, but colleagues united by the singular purpose of saving a life. Caldwell's hands were steady and sure as he followed Marcus's guidance. In this place, in this moment, the past didn't matter. The future didn't matter. There was only the present, only the child, only the desperate hope that skill and knowledge could overcome the mathematics of mortality. The surgery took 3 more hours. It was the most difficult 3 hours of Marcus's life, not because of the technical complexity, though it was complex, but because every moment in that operating room was a reminder of what he'd given up, what he'd lost, what he'd spent 14 years trying to forget. Every stitch, every perfectly executed movement, every small victory against the injury's devastation, it all felt like a conversation with the ghost of who he used to be. But Eliana Torres's heart began to beat again, truly beat, not just respond to the ECMO machine's artificial rhythm, but pulse with her own vital force. The monitors began to normalize. The surgical team, exhausted and amazed, began the work of closing, of stabilizing, of preparing the child for recovery. It was Caldwell who spoke to Marcus after the surgery was over, after they'd left the operating room and the weight of the fluorescent lights had lifted slightly. They were in the hallway outside the surgical suites, both of them still in their scrubs, both of them moving like men walking through water. "Who are you?" Caldwell asked. Not where are you from, not what are you doing here, but the one question that mattered. Marcus told him. He told him about Georgetown, about James Hartley, about the mistake that hadn't been a mistake so much as a moment of human frailty. He told him about the suspension, the isolation, the 14 years of invisibility. He told him everything, and when he was done, Caldwell was quiet for a very long time. "I reviewed your record," Caldwell said finally. "It came up after Dr. Chen made some inquiries. I should have fired you when I found out. A suspended surgeon working as a janitor in a hospital, it's an obvious liability, a risk. But I didn't, because I also read about your work before Georgetown fell apart. I read about the young surgeon who published findings that were being cited by hospitals across the country, and I realized that the person who saved Eliana Torres tonight was the same person who performed at that level. The next weeks were a whirlwind of investigation and bureaucracy. The hospital's legal team became involved. The state medical board was notified. There were questions about liability, about credentials, about the appropriateness of allowing someone with a suspension on their record to participate in surgery, even in an advisory capacity. But there was also something else. There was Eliana Torres, alive and recovering, her heart beating regularly in her small chest. There was her mother, Maria, who had held her daughter's hand as the child woke up from sedation, alive against impossible odds. And there was Sarah Chen, who had quietly investigated Marcus's background, who had left those journals and articles for him to find, who had somehow understood that the janitor who read medical literature in the hospital cafeteria was not just a man filling time, but a surgeon who had been lost. The hospital's administration made a decision that surprised no one who understood hospital politics, but shocked those who believed in rules and regulations. Marcus's suspension was formally ended, reviewed under current standards, and found to be outdated and inappropriate for the current context. The hospital would not offer him a position as a surgeon. That would be politically complicated and would invite the kind of scrutiny that administrators preferred to avoid. But they would allow him to train with Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Chen, to undergo a course of recertification, to prove that he could return to active practice. It took 8 months. 8 months of intensive study, of practical training, of slowly rebuilding the muscle memory of being a surgeon. 8 months of standing in the operating room again, of reading more than journals, but of performing actual procedures under supervision. 8 months of remembering why he'd wanted to do this in the first place, before his marriage had fallen apart, before grief and distraction had made him careless, before the weight of his own ambitions had nearly destroyed him. At the end of those 8 months, Marcus Webb performed his first surgery as a licensed surgeon since the suspension had been lifted. It was a routine coronary artery bypass graft, the kind of surgery he'd done hundreds of times before. But it felt new now, felt sacred, because it was a second chance. And second chances were not things that surgeons received often. Eliana Torres recovered completely. Her heart functioned normally, the graft holding as expected, her development proceeding without complication. She would grow up with a story about a little girl who'd been in a terrible accident, who'd been given up for dead, who'd been saved by the application of novel techniques and the desperation of people who refused to accept the mathematics of mortality. She would grow up not knowing that the man who'd saved her life had spent 14 years as a ghost in the hospital where she was healed, mopping floors and reading medical journals, waiting for a moment that he'd never expected to come. The news that the hospital's janitor had been a suspended surgeon spread through St. Michael's like wildfire. Some people felt vindicated in their suspicions. They'd known something was off about that man, they said. Others felt ashamed of their dismissal, their contempt, the casual cruelty of people who'd judged based on appearance and social position rather than actual merit. Dr. Caldwell, to his credit, acknowledged publicly that he'd been wrong, that he'd allowed social hierarchy to obscure his own medical judgment, and that Marcus Webb was one of the finest surgeons he'd ever worked with. The story made the local news. Philadelphia Inquirer ran a feature on the surgeon who'd been invisible in plain sight. Other news outlets picked it up. Within a month, hospitals across the country were calling, interested in recruiting Marcus Webb. The American College of Surgeons invited him to present a paper on the use of biocompatible mesh in myocardial repair. His research was no longer theoretical. It was validated by successful cases and by the kind of clinical outcomes that couldn't be argued with. Marcus had a choice to make. He could return to Georgetown, could try to reclaim some version of the position he'd lost 14 years earlier. He could move to one of the prestigious institutions that were calling. He could become the kind of surgeon he'd been meant to be before life had interrupted. But instead, he stayed at St. Anne. Michael's. Why? Sarah asked him one evening, weeks after his recertification, as they reviewed a patient's imaging together in the hospital's research office. You could go anywhere. You could be anyone again. I was anyone before, Marcus said. I was ambitious. I was driven. I was successful. And it all meant nothing because it wasn't built on anything real. It was built on the idea that I was special, that I was better, that my work mattered more than my humanity. Here I've had the luxury of being nobody for a long time, and somewhere in that nobodiness I became a surgeon again, not the kind who needed to prove anything, but the kind who genuinely wanted to save people. Over the following 5 years, Marcus saved 238 lives. Some of those lives were saved through conventional surgery, through mastery of technique and years of experience. Others were saved through his research, through the papers he published, through the techniques he developed that became standard across dozens of hospitals. The biocompatible mesh that had saved Eliana Torres became an approved treatment, available to patients across the country. Surgical teams trained in his techniques. Young surgeons came to St. Michael's specifically to work with him, to learn not just how to perform surgery, but how to be a surgeon, which meant understanding that the person in front of you, whether they were a CEO or a child in a car accident, deserved your complete attention, your best effort, your refusal to accept defeat. Eliana Torres visited the hospital on her 13th birthday with her mother. She wanted to meet the surgeons who'd saved her life, to thank them for the years she'd gotten to live because they'd refused to give up. When she met Marcus, she knew who he was immediately. The newspapers had told her that story, the one about the janitor turned surgeon. She was old enough now to understand what that meant, old enough to grasp the improbability of it, the miracle of timing and grace that had allowed her to live. My mum told me you were mocking people when you were reading those books, Eliana said, with the directness of a teenager, that they laughed at you. They did, Marcus said simply, but you kept reading anyway. You kept studying, even though they made fun of you. Yes. Why? She was genuinely curious, the way children are about the choices adults make. Marcus thought about this. He thought about the 14 years of invisibility, about the weight of carrying a secret that could have destroyed him if revealed, about the desperation that came from losing everything and having to learn how to be human again instead of just being successful. He thought about the exact moment when Sarah Chen had asked him a question about a surgical technique, and how that question had been the first time in 14 years that anyone had treated him as if his mind had value, as if his knowledge was worth something, as if he mattered. Because, Marcus said finally, when you lose everything, when you become invisible, you have to find a reason to keep going. That has nothing to do with ambition or success. For me, that reason was the knowledge itself. Understanding how the human body works, learning new techniques, being connected to a field I loved even in the smallest possible way, that kept me alive when everything else was gone. The mocking didn't matter because I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. And I was doing it because I believed that one day, somehow, knowledge might matter again. That hope kept me human. Eliana Torres would grow up and become a cardiac surgeon herself, inspired by the story of her own survival and the surgeon who'd made it possible. She would train under Marcus's guidance, would learn not just technique, but philosophy, the understanding that every patient deserved the best you had to give, that humility and continuous learning were not weaknesses but strengths, that the person mopping floors might have just as much knowledge, just as much to teach, as the person in the white coat. And in hospitals across the country, in training programs and surgical departments and research facilities, the lessons that Marcus Webb had learned through 14 years of isolation and invisibility began to propagate. They taught a generation of surgeons that judgment based on appearance or social status was not just morally wrong, but practically dangerous, that the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake had value beyond ambition, that humans were infinitely more complex than the roles they occupied. 238 lives saved. That was the number that would be used when his story was told and retold. But the real number, Marcus understood, was much higher. It included all the people those 238 would have gone on to help, all the children they would raise, all the love they would give, all the difference they would make in the world simply by virtue of being alive. It was impossible to quantify. It was beyond the reach of any accounting. When Marcus was finally offered the position of Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery, the same position that Caldwell was retiring from, he accepted it quietly, without fanfare. He didn't give a speech about redemption or second chances. He simply showed up on the first day of his new position and did what he'd always done. He worked, he studied, he cared for his patients, he taught his students, he pursued knowledge with the hunger of a man who'd once had it stripped away. And in the hospital cafeteria, where he'd once sat alone reading journals while people mocked him, there now sat a different group of isolated people, the struggling medical students, the nurses going back to school, the residents who felt overwhelmed, the people who were trying to improve themselves in a system that often resisted their growth. And they would see the chief of surgery occasionally join them, opening a journal or a textbook, reading with the same intensity he'd maintained for 14 years when he was nothing but invisible. He never mentioned his past to them. He simply sat among them, silent, present, a living example that invisibility was temporary, that knowledge once gained could never be taken away, that the mocking of others said nothing about your value and everything about their limitations. And without anyone needing to say a word, without any formal mentorship or official program, a new culture began to grow in that hospital, one where the person you dismissed might be the person who saves your life. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the inevitability of water finding its level. Within months of Marcus assuming his position as chief, the atmosphere of St. Michael's Hospital began to shift in subtle but profound ways. The condescension that had once permeated the institution, the casual dismissal of those in lower positions, the hierarchy of worth based on credentials rather than character, started to erode like limestone beneath flowing water. It began with small acts. A resident who'd been struggling with a particularly complex case found Marcus standing beside her during a late-night shift, not offering solutions but asking questions that guided her thinking toward answers she hadn't considered. A nursing assistant who'd mentioned wanting to return to school discovered that Marcus had personally contacted the hospital's administration to create a tuition reimbursement program specifically designed for support staff pursuing further education. A custodian who'd mentioned an interest in surgical technology received a recommendation for an internship, a foot in the door, a chance that wouldn't have existed before. Word spread through the hospital's invisible networks, the networks that existed among those who weren't supposed to matter, those whose conversations happened in supply rooms and break rooms and hallways during the night shift. People began to watch the chief of surgery with a kind of quiet fascination. They watched to see if his behavior matched his history, if he genuinely believed what his presence seemed to suggest, or if he was simply performing a more enlightened version of the same old hierarchy. It was a test he didn't know he was being given, but one he passed every single day by treating every person in the hospital, from the newest intern to the most senior administrator, with the same quality of attention and respect. 6 months into his tenure as chief, Marcus made a decision that shocked the hospital's board of directors. He implemented a new policy. Every surgeon who wanted to maintain their position at St. Michael's would be required to spend a minimum of 40 hours per year working in non-surgical capacities within the hospital. They would work in patient care areas where they had no authority, where they couldn't rely on their credentials to command respect, where they would have to relate to patients and staff as humans rather than as doctors. The policy was widely criticized by other hospitals' leadership as impractical and demoralizing. Several surgeons on staff threatened to resign. Marcus didn't back down. Instead, he was the first to fulfill the requirement, spending his first 40 hours working as a patient transporter, moving people from one part of the hospital to another, listening to their fears and their stories, understanding the vulnerability that came from being dependent on others for basic mobility and dignity. He pushed wheelchairs down corridors he'd once mopped. He held hands of frightened patients. He listened to an elderly woman named Dorothy tell him about the daughter she'd raised alone after her husband died, about the grandchildren she'd never met because her daughter had moved to California, about the fear that kept her awake at night. Not fear of the surgery she was about to have, but fear that she would wake up to discover herself even more alone than she'd been before. "You know what helps?" Marcus asked her gently as he wheeled her toward preoperative care. "What?" Dorothy's voice was small, fragile, knowing that people see you, not just as a patient, not just as a body that needs fixing, but as a person who matters. Your daughter in California, she doesn't see you maybe, but that doesn't mean you're invisible. There are people who will see you. You have to let them." Dorothy held his hand tighter, and Marcus realized that she'd understood something that most people never grasped until it was too late. That the greatest fear humans carried wasn't death, but insignificance. It was the terror of living a life that no one witnessed, of mattering to no one. And his entire career, he understood now, had been about reversing that particular form of death. Not just saving lives, but making people feel seen, making them understand that their existence had weight and value in the world. When he returned to his office after his 40 hours of patient transport work, there was a letter waiting for him from Dorothy's daughter, Catherine. She'd called the hospital asking who had transported her mother, wanting to thank the person who'd spent an afternoon listening to her mother's fears and somehow managing to soothe them in a way that no amount of preoperative medication had been able to accomplish. Catherine had taken a week off from her job in California, had flown to Philadelphia, had spent time with her mother for the first time in 3 years. She'd decided that distance wasn't as important as presence, that her career could accommodate a monthly visit home, that her mother's life and her own life were interconnected in ways she'd been too busy to notice until a stranger with a wheelchair and willing ears had reminded her. The letter ended with a single sentence. "You gave my mother her life back before she ever went into surgery. I hope you know what that means." Marcus kept that letter on his desk. He read it on days when the weight of his position threatened to overwhelm him, on days when he questioned whether his presence was actually making a difference or whether he was simply performing a more sophisticated version of the same old hierarchies that he'd escaped. The letter was proof that it mattered, that every small act of genuine recognition, every moment of truly seeing another person, had ripples that extended far beyond the immediate interaction. The other surgeons gradually came to understand that Marcus wasn't implementing the policy as punishment, but as teaching. Dr. Caldwell, now fully retired but still consulting occasionally, spent his 40 hours working in the hospital's patient registration area, where he discovered that the people who were struggling most weren't the patients with the most serious diagnoses, but those without insurance, without family support systems, without anyone to advocate for them when the medical system became too complex to navigate alone. He came back from that experience changed, older perhaps, but also more humble. He began working with hospital administration to create better support systems for vulnerable populations, using his credibility as a respected surgeon to push through initiatives that might have been dismissed if they'd come from anywhere else. Sarah Chen took her 40 hours in the emergency department as a nurse, and the experience reminded her of why she'd become a surgeon in the first place. Not for the prestige or the salary, but for the moments when she could make a real difference in someone's life. She found herself in tears one afternoon, holding the hand of a young man who'd been beaten nearly to death by his stepfather, knowing that she could fix his injuries but couldn't fix the systems that had allowed him to be abused in the first place. The experience galvanized her into action. She began working with social services to create better screening protocols for abuse, to ensure that the medical system wasn't just treating injuries, but identifying and interrupting cycles of violence. The hospital began to change. It was a glacial transformation in some ways, a sudden revolution in others. Applications to work at St. Michael's increased because word had spread through medical networks that this was a place where you were treated as a human being, where your ideas mattered regardless of your position, where the leadership actually lived according to principles they professed rather than simply preaching them to others. 2 years into Marcus's tenure as chief, the hospital received a grant to establish a new research center focused on underutilized surgical techniques that could improve outcomes in underserved populations. The funding was substantial, several $1 million, and the decision about how to use it would set the trajectory of the research for years to come. The hospital's board of directors held a meeting to discuss potential research directions. They invited Marcus to present his recommendations. Instead of presenting his own ideas, Marcus did something unprecedented. He invited representatives from every level of the hospital's workforce to contribute to the discussion. Not just doctors, but nurses, patient care assistants, administrative staff, even the people who worked in housekeeping. The meeting took 6 hours, and by the end of it, a clear consensus had emerged. The research center should focus on surgical innovations that could be implemented in resource-limited settings, techniques that didn't require cutting-edge technology or vast infrastructure to be effective. The goal was to democratize surgery, to ensure that the innovations developed at St. Michael's could actually be used in rural hospitals, in developing countries, in places where people were currently dying from treatable surgical conditions simply because they didn't have access to the most advanced techniques. It was a vision that would have never emerged from a room full of surgeons alone. It came from the fact that people from different positions in the hospital's hierarchy were allowed to speak, to contribute, to be seen as valuable members of a collective enterprise. The research center, when it opened 18 months later, bore the name of James Hartley, the patient whose death had set Marcus on the path that led to his 14 years of invisibility. The hospital had discovered that Hartley's widow was still living in Washington, D.C., still carrying the grief of her husband's death. The hospital's administration, with Marcus's support, reached out to her. They explained what had happened, how the tragedy of her husband's death had ultimately led to innovations that would save countless lives. They invited her to the opening of the research center, asked if she would consider establishing a memorial fund in her husband's name. Marcus didn't expect her to say yes. He didn't expect Eleanor Hartley to travel to Philadelphia, to stand beside him at the opening ceremony, to place her hand on his shoulder and say, "I've spent 20 years angry at the man who killed my husband. I'm tired of being angry. I want my husband's death to mean something. If this center does that, then I can finally let go of the grief." It was absolution that Marcus hadn't known he was seeking, but it broke something open in him. He'd carried the death of James Hartley in his chest like a stone for more than 2 decades. The stone was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer felt like a weight that was drowning him. It felt like a foundation, like something he could build upon, rather than something that was burying him. Eleanor stayed in Philadelphia for a week. She toured the hospital with Marcus. She met Eliana Torres, now 17 years old and volunteering in the pediatric wing while she applied to medical schools. She listened to stories of the lives that had been saved by the research and innovations that had emerged from the ashes of her husband's death. She cried often, but they were different kinds of tears. Tears that came from seeing meaning where there had only been meaninglessness. Tears that came from understanding that tragedy could be transformed into something that helped others. On the day Eleanor was leaving, she and Marcus stood together in the hospital's main lobby, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The ordinary chaos of a busy hospital flowing around them. "I forgive you," she said simply, "not because what happened wasn't terrible, but because I can see that you've spent the rest of your life making sure it meant something. That's not absolution. That's not mine to give. But it is recognition. You've been punished enough. It's time to let yourself live." After she left, Marcus found himself standing alone in that lobby, overwhelmed by the weight of what she'd said. He'd spent so long telling himself that he didn't deserve forgiveness, that invisibility was the appropriate response to his failure, that the only way to justify his continued existence was to work harder and save more lives. But Eleanor had pointed out something he'd been unable to see, that at some point, punishment stops being redemptive and becomes just another form of self-destruction. At some point, you have to accept that you're human, that humans make mistakes, that the measure of a person isn't defined by their worst moment, but by what they do in all the moments that follow. That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in more than 20 years. He called his ex-wife, Diana, the woman whose departure had been the catalyst for the moment of inattention that had killed James Hartley. He didn't expect her to answer. He didn't even know if the number was still active. But she picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" Her voice was older, cautious, not quite recognizing the caller ID. "Diana, it's Marcus Webb." There was a long silence. He could hear her breathing, could sense the complicated emotions that his name must have stirred up. "I know who you are," she said finally. "I've read the articles. I know about your surgery, about the girl you saved. I'm proud of you for that. But I'm not sure what you want from me." "I wanted to apologize," Marcus said, "for everything, for being so consumed by my work that I neglected you, for the distance between us, for not being present in our marriage when you needed me to be. I know it's too late to matter now, but I wanted you to know that I understand, finally, what I did to you, what I chose." Diana was quiet for a long moment. "You're calling me to apologize about something that happened more than 20 years ago?" "Yes." "That's not why you're really calling," she said, and there was no anger in her voice, just clarity. "You're calling because you're trying to absolve yourself of guilt. You're calling because you think saying sorry will somehow balance the scales. But Marcus, the scales don't balance. What happened between us happened. We both did things we regret. We both chose things that hurt each other. And then we moved on and built different lives. I'm glad you're saving people. I'm glad you found meaning in your work. But I don't need your apology. And honestly, your apology won't change anything for me. I forgave you years ago, not because you deserved it, but because I needed to move forward for my own sake." "Oh," Marcus said quietly. It was a simpler answer than he'd expected, but also somehow more honest. "I'm glad you called, though," Diana continued. "It's good to know that you're doing okay, that you found your way back to being a surgeon. That's what you always wanted, wasn't it? To be the best, to save people." "I think what I wanted was to matter," Marcus said, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "I thought being the best surgeon meant that I mattered. But I've learned that mattering has nothing to do with being the best. It has to do with showing up, with being present, with treating people like their existence has value." "That's wisdom," Diana said. "I'm glad you got there. And Marcus, you don't need my forgiveness. You never did. You just needed to forgive yourself." After they hung up, Marcus sat in his apartment, a modest two-bedroom place that he'd maintained throughout his entire time as a surgeon, and allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The journey from ambition to invisibility to redemption wasn't a neat narrative arc. It was messier than that, more complicated, full of contradictions and moments of grace that existed alongside moments of genuine struggle. He thought about the 238 lives he'd saved. He thought about Eliana Torres, who was now preparing to become a surgeon herself, carrying forward the lessons she'd learned from witnessing her own survival. He thought about all the patients he hadn't met, the ones he would save in the future if he continued his work. He thought about the changes he'd set in motion at the hospital, the way that a single person's commitment to treating others with dignity could create ripples that affected hundreds of other people. And he thought about the person he'd been, the ambitious, driven surgeon who'd been so consumed by his own importance that he'd become careless, that he'd made a mistake that had cost another person their life. That person felt like a stranger now, like someone he'd read about in a history book rather than someone he'd been. But he didn't hate that person anymore. He pitied him, understood him, recognized in him the desperate hunger for significance that drove so many high-achieving people into patterns of behavior that ultimately destroyed their own humanity. The hospital continued to grow under Marcus's leadership. The research center became a model for other institutions. Surgical teams from around the world came to St. Michael's to learn the techniques that were being developed there. Young surgeons began to seek out positions at the hospital specifically because they'd heard about the culture that Marcus was building. A culture where excellence and compassion weren't seen as opposing values, but as complementary elements of genuine healing. 5 years after Marcus became chief of surgery, the hospital received notification that it had been selected for a major international award recognizing institutional excellence in surgical care. The award ceremony would take place in Geneva, and Marcus was invited to accept it on behalf of the hospital. The night before the ceremony, he stood in his hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, watching the water reflect the lights of the city, and he found himself thinking about all the moments that had led to this point. He thought about the moment when Sarah Chen had asked him to help with Eliana Torres. He thought about the decision to trust his knowledge, to step out of invisibility and risk everything by revealing who he really was. He thought about the 14 years that had preceded that moment, the years of patient, persistent learning, even though he had no reason to believe it would ever matter again. He thought about the choice to stay at St. Michael's instead of taking a prestigious position elsewhere, the choice to invest in building a culture rather than building a reputation. And he thought about Eleanor Hartley's words, "It's time to let yourself live." He realized that he had been living all along, not in the way he'd imagined when he was a young surgeon at Georgetown, but in a deeper, more authentic way. He'd been living by showing up, by treating people with genuine respect, by building something that was bigger than himself, by allowing his own pain and failure to become a foundation for compassion rather than a well to draw bitterness from. The award ceremony was held in a grand ballroom, surrounded by surgeons and hospital administrators and medical professionals from around the world. When Marcus took the stage to accept the award, he didn't give a speech about his achievements or about the innovative techniques that had been developed at St. Michael's. Instead, he spoke about a girl named Eliana Torres, about a patient named James Hartley, about a woman named Eleanor who had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, about an ex-wife named Diana who had taught him that some lessons take decades to learn. He spoke about invisibility and what it taught you when you paid attention. He spoke about the knowledge that came from being willing to see people as complete humans rather than as roles or positions. He spoke about the choice that every surgeon, every doctor, every person in a position of power had to make every single day. The choice between treating people as means to an end and treating them as ends in themselves, as humans whose lives had intrinsic value that had nothing to do with their utility or their status or their contribution to society. And he spoke about the 238 lives, but he reframed the number, explaining that it wasn't really about the number at all. The number was arbitrary, a convenient way to quantify something that was actually unquantifiable. What mattered wasn't the count, but the commitment. The commitment to show up fully, to care deeply, to never accept defeat as inevitable, to believe that every single life had value simply because it existed. When he finished speaking, the ballroom was completely silent. Not the silence of people who were bored or unimpressed, but the silence of people who were processing something that had touched them, that had reminded them of something they'd forgotten. Then someone began to applaud, and the applause built and built until it filled the entire room, and Marcus realized that he was crying. Later that evening, at the reception following the ceremony, Marcus found himself in conversation with Dr. Amara Okonkwo, the daughter of Patricia Okonkwo, the chief of surgery, who'd authorized his entry into the operating room to save Eliana Torres all those years ago. Amara was now a surgeon herself, training in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, specifically because of the story of her mother's decision to trust an unknown janitor with knowledge to save a child's life. "My mother is 91 years old now," Amara said. "She's mostly retired, living in a care facility. But she follows your work. She talks about you often. She says that the moment when she made the decision to let you into that operating room was one of the most important decisions of her career, not because of what you saved, but because of what it taught her about the nature of expertise and the danger of assumptions." "Your mother was remarkable," Marcus said. "She saw past the uniform. She was willing to take a risk based on knowledge rather than credentials." "She says the same thing about you," Amara replied. "She says that you had every reason to protect yourself, to maintain the fiction of invisibility, to stay safe, but you chose to risk everything because a child's life mattered more than your security. She says that's the definition of courage, and it's the definition of what medicine should be." As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself surrounded by people who wanted to tell him their stories. People whose lives had been touched by his work, either directly or indirectly. A woman whose mother had been a patient at St. Michael's and who'd been saved by one of the techniques developed in the research center. A young surgeon who'd been trained at the hospital and who'd gone on to establish similar programs in rural areas across 3 different countries. A nurse who'd been inspired by Marcus's policy to return to school and was now pursuing her doctorate in public health. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry, and as Marcus listened to them, he began to understand something that had eluded him for most of his life. Significance didn't come from individual achievement, from being the best, from performing the most complex surgeries or publishing the most important research. Significance came from the ripples, from the ways that your choices influenced other people's choices, from the culture you created that allowed others to become their better selves. His refusal to accept invisibility as his permanent fate had not just saved his own life, it had created the conditions for hundreds of other people to re-examine their own assumptions about worth and value. Eliana Torres was becoming a surgeon because of his example. Countless people had been influenced by the new culture at St. Michael's. Surgeons around the world were implementing techniques that had been developed in the research center, saving lives in places he would never visit. And none of that would have happened if he'd stayed invisible, if he'd chosen safety over vulnerability, if he'd accepted the world's judgment about what he was capable of being. The flight back to Philadelphia the next day felt different from any flight he'd taken before. Marcus sat in his seat, watching the landscape pass beneath him, and he felt something that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Contentment. Not the kind of contentment that comes from believing you've arrived at your destination, but the kind that comes from understanding that the journey itself is the destination, that the process of becoming is more important than the achievement of being. When he returned to the hospital, there was a note waiting on his desk from Eleanor Hartley. She'd heard about the award ceremony. She was sending her congratulations, along with a photograph. The photograph showed Eleanor, now in her 80s, standing in front of the James Hartley Research Center, smiling. The note read, "I've decided to establish an endowment in my husband's name to fund scholarships for students from underrepresented backgrounds who want to pursue careers in medicine. My husband was many things, but one of his best qualities was that he believed everyone deserved a fair chance. I think he would like knowing that his death is helping to create opportunities for people who might not otherwise have them. Thank you for showing me how to turn tragedy into purpose." Marcus read the note multiple times. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The error in the operating room, the suspension, the 14 years of invisibility, the moment when Sarah Chen had trusted him enough to bring him to Eliana Torres's bedside, the surgery that had gone impossibly well, the slow process of rebuilding his career, and now this full circle where the loss had become a foundation for helping others. He understood, finally, what his ex-wife Diana had meant when she said that he didn't need forgiveness from anyone else. He needed to forgive himself. And that process of self-forgiveness hadn't come from achieving redemption, or from saving a certain number of lives, or from receiving awards or recognition. It had come from the daily choice to show up, to be present, to treat people as if they mattered, even when the world was telling him that he didn't. The remaining years of Marcus's career were marked not by the pursuit of achievement, but by the intentional construction of a legacy that would outlast him. He continued to perform surgery, but he spent increasingly more of his time mentoring younger surgeons, teaching not just technical skills, but the philosophical underpinning of what it meant to be a healer, in a world that often reduced human beings to diagnoses and treatments. He established a formal program at St. Michael's called the Invisibility Project, a program designed to ensure that everyone working in the hospital, regardless of their position, was seen as a valuable member of the healing community. The program included the mandatory 40-hour cross-departmental experience for all surgical staff, but it also included regular forums where people from different positions in the hospital could discuss challenges, share ideas, and collectively problem-solve about the systems and culture of the institution. The Invisibility Project became a model that other hospitals began to adopt. Marcus was invited to speak at medical conferences around the world about the program, about the philosophical framework that had inspired it, about what he'd learned from his own experience of invisibility. He always began his presentations with the same statement: "I became invisible not because of who I was, but because of the position I occupied. My story is not unique. Every day there are people being rendered invisible by the systems we've created, by the hierarchies we maintain, by the assumptions we make about the value of different kinds of work. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether we're willing to see them. Because when we do, when we truly see people, we don't just save individual lives, we transform institutions. We create cultures where excellence and compassion are inseparable. We build systems that work for everyone, not just for those at the top." Eliana Torres was accepted to medical school at Johns Hopkins, where she pursued a degree in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. She specifically requested Marcus as her mentor during her training, and he guided her through the process of becoming a surgeon with the same care and attention that he'd received from Dr. Caldwell. But more importantly, he taught her the lessons that he'd learned through his own invisible years. That compassion wasn't weakness, that understanding your patients as complete human beings didn't compromise your clinical judgment, that the best surgeries came not from individuals operating in isolation, but from teams that saw and respected each other. When Eliana performed her first independent surgery, a complex case that required the kinds of innovations that Marcus had pioneered, she dedicated it to the memory of James Hartley, the patient whose death had set in motion the events that ultimately made her own survival possible. She understood, as Marcus did, that the human story wasn't a simple narrative of triumph or redemption. It was something more complex, more nuanced, a tapestry woven from threads of tragedy and grace, failure and persistence, invisibility and recognition. 10 years after Marcus had become chief of surgery at St. Michael's, he was offered the position of president of the American College of Surgeons, one of the highest honors in the surgical profession. He turned it down. Instead, he chose to continue his work at St. Michael's, to maintain his presence in the institution where his transformation had occurred, to continue building the culture that he'd started. In his letter declining the position, he wrote, "I have learned that significance is not measured by titles or positions, but by the depth of relationships we build and the impact we have on the daily lives of those around us. I am more powerful in my current role, doing the work I've always wanted to do, than I would be in any position of elevated authority. I choose to remain where I can make the greatest difference." The letter became somewhat famous in medical circles, cited as an example of a leader who understood that true influence came not from ascending the hierarchy, but from investing in the systems and people you worked with directly. Other surgeons and physicians began to question their own assumptions about advancement and success. Some followed Marcus's example, turning down prestigious positions to remain in roles where they felt they could have the most direct impact. The hospital itself became a destination not just for treatment, but for training, for learning, for understanding a different model of medical practice. Hundreds of surgeons trained at St. Michael's and went on to implement similar cultures in their own institutions. The effect was gradual but profound, a slow shift in the medical world's understanding of what leadership meant, of what excellence looked like, of how to build systems that brought out the best in people rather than systems that forced people to choose between compassion and success. By the time Marcus reached his early 70s, he'd begun to slow down, to shift more of his surgical work to younger physicians, to focus increasingly on mentorship and teaching. He still spent his breaks reading medical journals, but now students would frequently join him, asking him questions about the articles, learning not just from the technical knowledge, but from watching the way he approached learning, with curiosity, with humility, with the recognition that understanding was an ongoing process that never really concluded. One afternoon, while sitting in the hospital cafeteria, the same cafeteria where he'd once sat alone, reading journals while people mocked him, Marcus was approached by a young man who worked in the hospital's maintenance department. The young man, whose name was David, was nervous, clearly uncomfortable approaching the chief of surgery. But he had something to show Marcus, a journal article about a new approach to surgical site infections, something that the hospital's cleaning protocols might be able to improve. Marcus looked at the article, read it carefully, and then looked up at David with complete seriousness. "This is excellent," Marcus said. "Have you talked to anyone about this?" "No, sir. I wasn't sure if anyone would care about ideas from someone in maintenance." "They should," Marcus said. "This is the kind of thinking that makes institutions better. Come with me. I want to introduce you to Dr. Chen. She oversees our infection control protocols, and I think she'll want to hear what you have to say." David's face transformed. The nervousness gave way to something like hope. The possibility that his ideas might actually matter, that he might be seen as someone who could contribute. Marcus guided him upstairs to Sarah's office, and within 20 minutes, a conversation had begun that would ultimately lead to changes in the hospital's cleaning protocols that would reduce surgical site infections by nearly 15%. That evening, Marcus sat in his office thinking about how the circle had come full circle. He'd been seen once, pulled out of invisibility by someone who was willing to look beyond the uniform to the knowledge and capability underneath. And now he was spending much of his life creating conditions where other people could be seen, could be recognized, could be given the chance to contribute their knowledge and their ideas, regardless of the position they occupied. It wasn't the redemption he'd imagined when he'd been invisible. It was something deeper, something more meaningful. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that the tragedy of James Hartley's death hadn't happened. It was about transforming that tragedy into something generative, something that created life rather than just ending it. Something that made the world better for countless people who would never know the story of how it all began. Marcus thought about calling Diana again, but he didn't. They'd said what needed to be said. Instead, he called Eleanor Hartley. She answered on the second ring, her voice still clear and strong despite her advancing age. "Eleanor, I wanted you to know that something happened today that I thought you'd appreciate knowing about. Someone from the maintenance staff of the hospital came to me with an idea about improving our infection control. It was a great idea, and I helped connect him with the right people to implement it. It's going to save lives. And I kept thinking about your husband, about how he believed everyone deserved a fair chance. I thought he would like knowing that the systems we're building here are giving people like David, people whose ideas might otherwise never be heard, the opportunity to contribute and to be recognized." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could hear her breathing, could sense her processing the meaning of what he'd said. "That's beautiful, Marcus," she said finally. "That's exactly what my husband would have wanted. You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about forgiveness and redemption, about what those words really mean. I don't think they mean erasing the past. I think they mean transforming the past into something that serves a higher purpose. And that's what you've done. That's what you continue to do every single day. You've transformed what happened into something that helps people. That's the best kind of redemption." After the call ended, Marcus sat in the gathering dusk of his office and allowed himself to feel the full weight and wonder of his life. He'd been brought so low, made so invisible, that he'd almost disappeared entirely. But in that invisibility, in that forced humility, he'd learned something that most people never learned. That visibility wasn't about position or title or achievement. It was about connection. It was about being seen by other people and in turn truly seeing them. It was about recognizing that every person you encountered had a story, had dreams, had capabilities that might never be discovered unless someone took the time to look past the surface. 238 lives saved through surgery. But the real number, the number that mattered most, was immeasurable. It included every person who'd been treated with dignity when they expected to be dismissed, every student who'd been given a chance when the system said they didn't qualify, every idea that had been heard when it came from someone unexpected, every culture that had been transformed because one person decided that invisibility didn't have to be permanent. The janitor who read medical journals on his break had become the surgeon who saved 200 lives. But more importantly, he'd become the leader who created a world where everyone had the chance to be seen, where knowledge was valued regardless of its source, where the person mopping floors might have insights as valuable as the person in the white coat. And in doing so, he'd created not just individual redemption, but systemic transformation, a living proof that when we choose to see people truly, when we treat every human being as if they matter, we don't just change individual lives, we change the world.